It was a warm, sunny afternoon when a group of friends decided to explore the old treehouse in the woods, a place they hadn't visited in years. The treehouse had been part of their childhood, a secret hideaway where they'd spent countless afternoons playing games and telling stories. But as time passed, the treehouse was forgotten, left to slowly decay under the weight of nature. Vines crawled up its wooden walls, and the trees surrounding it grew taller, almost as though they were trying to hide it from the world. Despite its abandonment, the friends, Jake, Anna, and a couple of others, still remembered it. They thought it would be fun to revisit, not really expecting anything unusual. They had no idea that the treehouse held secrets darker than they could ever imagine. When they arrived, the air around it felt strangely heavy. The warm sunlight seemed to disappear the closer they got, and a sense of unease hung in the atmosphere, like a thick fog. They tried to shake off the feeling, brushing it aside as nothing more than the natural spookiness of the woods. Yet, the closer they came, the stronger the feeling grew, as if something were silently watching them. Jake, being the most adventurous of the group, led the way up the rickety wooden ladder, followed by Anna and the others. The wood creaked under their weight, as though the treehouse itself was warning them to turn back, but they pressed on. Once they made it to the platform, they took a moment to look around, marveling at how little had changed. The view was the same as they remembered, looking out over the wide expanse of the forest. The nostalgia should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Something felt off. The treehouse, which should have been a symbol of happy memories, now seemed strange and unwelcoming. They walked inside, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Dust hung in the air, and the faint smell of mildew was noticeable, but none of them paid it much mind. Their eyes soon fell on something that had never been there before. A large, old wooden box tucked away in the corner. It wasn't just any box. It looked ancient, out of place, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. It was clearly old, the wood darkened with age, and the corners were worn from time. The lid was sealed shut, but what caught their attention more than anything was the strange symbol carved into its surface. The symbol was unfamiliar, something none of them had ever seen before. It was almost like a warning, but they didn't understand it. They should have turned away then, but curiosity got the better of them. Without really thinking about the strange feeling that was creeping up on them, Jake approached the box. As soon as his fingers touched it, the air around them seemed to shift. A sudden coldness swept over the treehouse, making their breath fog in the air. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up, but Jake, determined to see what was inside, slowly lifted the lid. What they found inside was both puzzling and terrifying. A single yellowed piece of paper. Written on it were just a few simple words. "Leave now." But before they could react, a strange, low whisper seemed to rise from the darkness, filling the room. It wasn't a voice they could recognize, but it was unmistakably there, urging them to flee. The chill in the air deepened, and without a word, they all rushed out of the treehouse. But as they descended the ladder and stepped away from the treehouse, they felt as though something was still with them, something that didn't want them to leave, something that would not let them forget. The moment they stepped away from the treehouse, the group felt a sense of relief. But that feeling quickly faded. The further they walked, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere seemed to become. The air felt thick, as if the world around them was pressing in, making it harder to breathe. There was an unsettling silence, almost unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It was as though everything around them, the trees, the wind, even the ground beneath their feet, had suddenly turned still, waiting. Jake, still holding the strange box's lid in his hand, glanced over his shoulder, half expecting the treehouse to be gone, like some kind of mirage. But it stood there, unchanged, its windows dark and uninviting. The whispers that had haunted the treehouse seemed to follow them, growing louder and clearer with each step they took away from the old wooden structure. At first, the sounds were soft, like the rustling of leaves in the distance, but soon they grew more distinct, more menacing. The voices seemed to come from all around them, echoing through the trees, and they could no longer ignore the eerie sensation that someone, was watching. Every so often, a figure appeared in the corner of their vision. At first, it seemed like the movement of a bird or a small animal, darting quickly between the trees, but the shadows were different. These shadows were too dark, too deliberate, not like anything the group had seen in the forest before. Each time they turned to look, there was nothing there, but the sense of being followed never disappeared. The further they ventured down the path, the heavier the silence became, until it was suffocating. The only sound they could hear was the pounding of their own hearts. Anna, who was usually the first to brush off her fears, now felt a growing sense of dread creeping up her spine. Her steps slowed, and she glanced nervously at the others. They were all uneasy, but none of them dared to speak, as if voicing their fear would make it all the more real. The temperature had dropped, and they could see their breath fogging in. The air. It wasn't just cold, it was a chilling cold, the kind that seeped into your bones, making you feel as though you were being swallowed by the darkness. Even the trees around them seemed different now. The trunks were thick with years of growth, their branches twisted, reaching out like skeletal arms. The forest, once a familiar and friendly place, had transformed into something sinister, a labyrinth that had lost its way. The voices, which had once seemed distant, now echoed in their ears, each whisper sharper than the last. It was almost as if they were speaking directly to the group, warning them of something they couldn't quite understand. But before anyone could voice their concern, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. Just as they thought they might be free of the haunting sounds, a sudden movement caught their eye. A figure tall and thin stood in the doorway of the treehouse. The figure was far too still to be a person, and far too dark to be a shadow. It looked like something that didn't belong in the real world, something unnatural. And it was watching them. Their blood ran cold. They all turned to run, but it was too late. Something from the treehouse had followed them. The fear that gripped them after seeing the shadowy figure in the doorway of the treehouse lingered long after they had left the woods. The eerie presence of that dark shape was enough to make their legs tremble, but the further they walked, the more they tried to convince themselves that it was all in their heads. They couldn't explain what they had seen. Maybe it was just the light playing tricks or their imagination running wild after everything they had experienced. But none of them could shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that something was waiting for them. That night, they couldn't escape the oppressive thoughts. As Jake lay in his bed, the memory of the treehouse haunted him. His mind kept replaying the image of that figure, standing motionless, its dark form blending with the shadows. It was as if the woods had come alive, but it was too late to turn back. The whispers had followed them back to the safety of their homes, echoing in the silence of their rooms. At first they were faint, barely audible, like the wind blowing through the trees outside, but then they grew louder. They began to sound almost like voices, soft and distant, as though calling their names, and each time the whispers grew clearer, they filled Jake's mind with an overwhelming sense of dread. No matter how many times he tried to shake off the feeling, the whispers grew louder, relentless. It was as if the treehouse, the box, had put a curse on him, and he couldn't escape it. In a desperate attempt to end the unease, Jake decided to return to the treehouse the next day, hoping that maybe, just maybe, facing whatever was there would bring some kind of closure. The others were hesitant, but they agreed, figuring they would go together for safety. When they reached the edge of the woods, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt thick again, but this time it wasn't just the feeling of unease. They could almost taste the heaviness, the way the air seemed charged with something dark and powerful. It felt like they were walking into a trap, and they couldn't turn back now. As they approached the treehouse, the shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting around them as if reaching for their ankles. The treehouse itself seemed different, now, darker, more foreboding, and somehow watching them. It was almost as if the place had come alive with some dark energy, and it knew they were coming. As they climbed up, the cold air grew sharper, biting into their skin, and a chill ran down their spines as they stepped onto the treehouse platform. Inside, nothing had changed, but everything felt wrong. The box was still there, untouched, sitting in the corner like an ominous reminder of what had happened. But the worst part wasn't the box. It was the feeling in the air, the presence that seemed to be lurking just out of sight. That's when they noticed it again. The symbol carved into the box. The symbol was the same, yet it looked more vivid, more alive. It was as if the treehouse itself was calling to them, urging them to open the box once more. But none of them wanted to. They stood frozen, each of them terrified of what might happen if they did. And yet, none of them could leave. The whispers had become louder, their voices sharper, more demanding. It was as if the box had a grip on their minds, pulling them toward it. No matter how hard they tried to fight it, the temptation to open it was overwhelming. The feeling of being watched, of being trapped, grew stronger with every passing second. They couldn't stay much longer, but something in the pit of their stomachs told them they couldn't leave either. Whatever was in that treehouse was far from finished. The oppressive silence of the treehouse seemed to swallow everything around them, as if the very air itself was holding its breath. None of them could shake the feeling that something sinister lurked just beyond their vision, a presence that watched them, waiting for the right moment. They couldn't move, couldn't speak. Fear had paralyzed them, and the only sound in the room was their breathing, shallow and ragged. The box, still sitting ominously in the corner, seemed to pulse with an energy they could feel deep in their bones. The symbol on it now appeared sharper, more vivid, as if it had been freshly carved. It was almost as if the box was calling to them, urging them to open it, to give in to the dark temptation. Jake's hand trembled as he reached out toward it, though every instinct in him screamed to stop. His fingers brushed the lid, and instantly, the room grew colder. The temperature plummeted, and the walls of the treehouse seemed to close in, shrinking around them. The whispers, now louder and more distinct, filled their ears. No longer just a faint sound, but a chorus of voices, each one rasping in their minds, telling them things they couldn't understand, but knew were threatening. As his hand lingered on the box, the whispers became frantic, almost desperate, as if they were trying to stop him, warning him of some terrible consequence. But it was too late. The lid of the box creaked open, and a rush of cold air burst forth, filling the small space with a bone-chilling frost. It was like stepping into the heart of winter itself. The voices suddenly stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that sent a shiver down their spines. As the coldness enveloped them, their eyes fixed on the contents of the box. There was nothing in it but darkness, absolute, pitch-black darkness that seemed to swirl and move as though alive. The shadow inside was so deep, so consuming, that it felt as though it could swallow the very light of the room. The temperature continued to drop, and their breaths turned to visible mist in the freezing air. For a moment, none of them could move, trapped in the terror of the unknown. But then, something shifted. From the darkness in the box, a figure began to emerge. Slowly, impossibly slowly, a form began to take shape, tall, shadowy, and formless at first. As it materialized, they could make out a face, but it was distorted, like an image fading in and out of focus. The figure seemed to flicker in and out of existence, but each time it became more solid, more real. Its eyes were the worst part. Black as night, they gleamed with malice, fixed on each one of them, one by one. The figure stepped out of the box, its presence filling the treehouse with a palpable sense of evil. The air seemed to grow even colder, and the walls of the treehouse seemed to tremble. It was no longer just a feeling, it was undeniable. They were not alone. The figure moved toward them with an unnatural grace, its footsteps soundless, yet somehow heavy, as though the very ground beneath them could sense its presence. Panic set in, and they tried to move, to run, but their bodies refused to obey. Fear had frozen them in place. The figure spoke, its voice not a sound but a feeling, cold, hollow, and empty, like the void itself. It whispered their names, one by one, sending an icy chill through their veins. They had opened the box, and now there was no turning back. The shadow had come to claim them. The figure loomed in front of them, its presence suffocating the air, pressing in on all sides. Time seemed to slow, each second dragging out in an endless, nightmarish stretch. The creature's black, empty eyes bore into them, its gaze so intense, it felt as if it could reach inside their very souls. Fear clamped down on their chests, a heavy weight that made it impossible to breathe. The whispers from before had returned, louder now, swirling in the air around them, speaking in languages they couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Menacing, cruel. They could feel the presence of the figure, but it wasn't, just in front of them. It surrounded them, its malevolent aura seeping into their skin, poisoning their thoughts. Each of them, frozen in place, was gripped by a feeling that something unspeakable had been unleashed. No one dared to move, but their eyes darted around, searching for any way out, any escape from the nightmare they had inadvertently unleashed. But the treehouse felt different now. The walls seemed to close in, the space becoming smaller with each passing moment, until they felt as if the very wood of the structure was closing around them like a trap. The figure took a step forward, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. It was impossible to look away from the eyes of the creature, which now seemed to glow with an unnatural light, flickering in and out like an infernal flame. The air grew colder still, so cold that their bones felt as though they were freezing from the inside out. With each breath, their lungs burned, the air sharp and biting. The figure tilted its head, an eerie gesture that made their blood run cold. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but more like a whisper inside their heads, it spoke. The words were incomprehensible, but the meaning was clear. They had trespassed, disturbed something ancient and powerful, and there was no way back. Each of them, in turn, felt a sharp pang of fear in their chest, as though the creature had plucked out their deepest secrets and fears. It was as if the shadow knew their every thought, their every weakness, and was savoring their terror. The feeling of dread intensified, unbearable now, pressing down on them from all sides. Then, the figure stepped back, fading into the darkness of the treehouse. For a fleeting moment, they thought it had disappeared, that the nightmare had ended. But they were wrong. The darkness itself seemed to ripple, as though the air itself had become alive. And then, with a suddenness that made them flinch, the figure reappeared, no longer just a shadow, but something far worse. The shape was now solid, its outline sharper, its form fully materialized. The figure had become real, and they could see it clearly now. An entity unlike anything from this world, its body long and thin, its movements slow and deliberate. The creature smiled then, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of malice, one that promised nothing but pain and suffering. Its presence filled the treehouse, suffocating them, as though it were the very thing that kept the world from turning. They had opened the box, and now there would be no escape. The figure's eyes locked onto them again, each gaze feeling like a needle through the heart. There was no hope left. The darkness had claimed them. The air inside the treehouse thickened with an oppressive pressure, each breath feeling like it might be their last. The creature, now fully materialized, stood before them, its presence dominating everything in the room. It wasn't just an entity. It felt like the embodiment of every nightmare, every fear they had ever felt, brought to life in front of them. Its eyes, black as the void, never left them, piercing into their souls with a relentless hunger. The figure's smile twisted, not in amusement, but in cruel anticipation. It knew that they were powerless, trapped within the very walls of the treehouse they had once believed to be a simple structure in the woods. The whispers, those maddening, unintelligible sounds, grew louder now, swirling around them like a storm, making it almost impossible to think clearly. Every breath they took seemed to carry with it the weight of 1,000 suffocating thoughts. It felt like the treehouse had become a prison, and the figure standing before them was the warden, waiting to claim them. But still, none of them could move, none of them could speak. Fear had paralyzed them, and the chilling realization that they had invited something ancient and terrifying into their lives settled heavily in their chests. They had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The creature's voice, a hollow, empty sound, echoed inside their heads, the words echoing with an almost hypnotic cadence. It wasn't speaking aloud, but its presence invaded their thoughts, filling them with a sense of doom so powerful that they felt as though their minds might crack under the strain. The figure's form began to shift, its edges blurring and stretching as though it existed in multiple dimensions at once. It flickered in and out, now here, now not, but always watching, always drawing closer. The space around them seemed to warp, and the walls of the treehouse began to twist, the familiar wooden planks turning into something dark and sinister. The ceiling seemed to drop lower. The floors felt unstable, as if the entire structure was crumbling in on itself, being absorbed into the darkness. The figure moved with unnatural grace, each step it took causing the air to grow colder, until their breath came out in visible puffs. It circled them, not saying a word, but its presence made every muscle in their bodies tense, every instinct, screaming at them to run. Yet they knew there was no escape. No matter which way they turned, the creature was always there, always present, always closer. Panic spread through their veins like wildfire, but as hard as they tried, their bodies refused to obey. The terror in their hearts intensified, each of them desperate to break free from the paralyzing fear, but the darkness had them in its grip. It had been waiting for them, and now it was time to collect what had been promised. The treehouse had become a place of torment, its once comforting walls now a cage, and the figure a tormentor who fed on their fear. The whispers began to crescendo, drowning out everything else until all they could hear was the sound of their own frantic heartbeat. The figure loomed over them now, its shadow stretching far beyond what should have been possible, until it seemed to fill every inch of the space. Their fate was sealed. There was no escape, no salvation. The darkness had claimed them, and they would remain trapped in its suffocating embrace forever. The room, once familiar and comforting, had transformed into a nightmare that felt as though it stretched beyond the limits of the treehouse itself. Every corner, every inch of the wooden walls now seemed alive, pulsating with a cold, malevolent energy. The figure, its eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light, moved with unnatural fluidity, circling them like a predator stalking its prey. The whispers had become deafening, drowning out their thoughts, drowning out any hope of reasoning, any possibility of escape. It was as if the very walls were closing in on them, compressing their fear until it felt as though they were suffocating under the weight of it all. They tried to cry out, to scream for help, but their voices were strangled by the growing chill in the air. Fear gripped them like a vice, and the freezing cold that had seeped into their bones felt like an extension of the creature itself, a manifestation of the terror it had come to instill. No one could move. No one could speak. The shadow moved closer, its presence a tangible force pressing down on them. Its black eyes glistened with an eerie hunger, as though it could sense every fragile, fleeting thought running through their minds. The silence between the whispers was suffocating, and in that silence, they could feel the presence of something far worse than the creature itself. The knowledge that they had crossed a line, and now it was too late to turn back. The treehouse had never been just a treehouse. It had been a gateway, a point of connection to something far older, far darker than they had ever imagined. The realization hit them with the force of a crashing wave, but it was a realization that came too late. They had opened the box, and by doing so, they had invited the darkness into their lives. And now, the darkness had come to claim them. The creature stopped its circling, standing directly in front of them now, its form more solid than ever, its features twisted and unnatural. It looked at each one of them in turn, its gaze piercing deep into their souls. Time seemed to stretch out, each second an eternity, as though the very fabric of reality had begun to unravel around them. The figure opened its mouth, but no sound came forth, just an overwhelming sense of dread, an oppressive weight that crushed down on them with such intensity that they could barely stand it. The cold reached deeper, gnawing at their flesh, and the darkness around them felt like it was pulling them in, dragging them towards a fate they could not escape. It wasn't until the creature moved, its form shifting like liquid darkness, that they understood. The darkness was not a force they could fight, not a thing they could run from. It had no physical form, no limitations. It was everywhere. It was in the walls, in the air, in their minds. It had always been there, waiting for them to make the mistake of opening the box. The last thing they heard before the shadows swallowed them completely was the voice of the creature. No words, just a feeling of finality, a sense that they were now part of the darkness, consumed by it, trapped in its endless void. The treehouse had become a tomb, and they had become its final, eternal residence. The whispers grew silent, and the figure faded into the nothingness, leaving behind nothing but cold, empty silence.